Hello, it's wonderful to be here virtually talking to you about the 1911 census and suffrage boycotts. I'm VICKY-IGLIKOWSKI-BROAD, Principal Record Specialist in Diverse Histories at the National Archives. I've been lucky enough in my role at the National Archives to have been involved in this fantastic project mapping women's suffrage from the early days. So thank you very much to the Mapping Women's Suffrage project for inviting me to speak as part of this programme. I just want to give you some background on the collections that we have at the National Archives relating to the movement for women's suffrage. Now, as you may know, the National Archives records offer a great insight into campaigns for women to get the vote. As the official archive and publisher for the UK government and for England and Wales, the National Archives records reflect the historic interests of government at various points over the 1,000 years of our collections. However, the interests of government kind of skew the focus of our collections. So in terms of the movement for women's suffrage, the government was most interested in the militant actions and the campaigners behind them. And ultimately, this was a kind of minority part of the movement for women's suffrage. It was the bit that caught the headlines, but in many ways was the smaller part of the movement. So while our collections are amazing relating to militant campaigners, they're really the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we hold. So what I want to talk to you about today is one of the best sources that we have for researching suffrage supporters. And that's actually the 1911 census. So this source is most often associated with family history. The details are sometimes sparse, and yet they start to give a rich picture of people's home lives, where they lived, what jobs they did, indicators of social class, all sorts of fascinating details that we wouldn't tend to have about the kind of foot soldiers of the suffrage movement. And these 1911 census records essentially offer a snapshot of this national movement at a high point of these women's suffrage campaigns. Now, not to oversimplify things, but I think there's two primary ways that the census, the 1911 census, is particularly rich and helpful in learning about suffrage supporters. The first is in a very general way, to learn about any suffrage supporters, no matter whether or not they boycotted the census. It starts to give a picture of the richness of individuals' lives and the wider context in which the movement was working in. But secondly, the census also allows us an insight into the ways suffrage supporters were prepared to protest and articulate their arguments. The wonderful thing about the census boycotts is that they capture many suffrage supporters we would otherwise know very little about. The very nature of the census is to try, despite the suffrage evasion, to capture everyone, no matter their class, political affiliation, or background. So it tells us about leaders of the movement, but also lesser known individuals. So in this talk, I'm going to try and talk you through some of my favourite census protests to show a variety of the types of protests people made, and also reflect on why these records are so significant. In 1911, votes for women was one of the biggest domestic political issues of the day. Despite decades of passionate campaigns, the government still refused to give women the franchise. Suffrage supporters across the country remained determined to find yet another way to put pressure on the government. And this time their means was a mass census boycott, a really innovative way of approaching the subject. The argument was simple. If they were not treated as citizens with a voice, they would not let themselves be counted on the census. This was intentionally designed to be disruptive to the running of government. The Women's Freedom League, or WFL, had instigated the suffrage census protests, mobilising women from a range of societies to evade. The WFL were one of the most prominent suffrage organisations. They campaigned using the colours white, gold and green, and their stance was to generally support militant but non-violent action. The boycott was also supported by the Women's Social and Political Union, or WSPU, and the Tax Resistance League, as well as many other organisations. Individuals who supported Votes for Women were often part of multiple suffrage societies, so might choose their steer from one society but not another, or they might have just followed their own instinct and boycotted the census. So, to census night. On the night of the 2nd of April 1911, census enumerators were collecting the details of households across Britain. At the same time, in one corner of London, a plainclothes police officer kept a quiet watch on the King's Road in Chelsea. The house being watched was Onslow Studios. The officer stayed from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., diligently noting down any movements of people leaving the property. The officer noted 4 males and 4 females entering the building, but only 3 males and 2 females leaving. So why was this being observed? It was believed that these individuals were supporters of Votes for Women. Across London, other women were being observed silently. Superintendents had been told to arrange a reliable and discreet police officer to be employed in plain clothes outside a number of places, and we can see some of those places listed on screen. The places they observed were based on their intelligence gathering from sources such as the Votes for Women newspaper and their surveillance of militant suffrage organisations. On the night of the census, many different activities were going on. Some individuals had uprooted from home for the night, while others had actively created big gatherings. In many ways, these different approaches kept the police on their toes. Annie Kenney, a key leader in the WSPU, suggested many people would be holding balls, drawing room meetings, and smoking concerts. One of the most significant census parties took place in central London and was primarily organised by the WSPU, so the Pankhurst organisation. While the boycott of the census itself was important, so was the associated publicity and platform it provided the suffrage cause. The day before the census, a mass meeting was held in Trafalgar Square. Police reports detailed a crowd slowly gathering, with about 1,000 people in the square by midnight, a mixture of both men and women. Some of these individuals then headed to Aldwych skating rink on the Strand. This included key leaders in the movement. The skating rink was just around the corner from the WSPU headquarters at 4 Clements Inn and near the WFL headquarters at 1 Robert Street. Census enumerators estimated around 500 women and 70 men that were present, although at one point police observed 2,000 people assembled outside the skating rink. Inside the rink, performances were hosted by the Actresses Franchise League, and a number of speakers took to the stage, including Christabel Pankhurst. Christabel addressed the meeting on the subject of militancy, saying that she hoped the census protests had shown their promise of more militant action. So why was the 1911 census in particular so unique? From the early 19th century, there had been multiple censuses, and from 1841 onwards, they strove to capture the names of every individual. But the 1911 census was particularly different as the first census where the forms which were completed by householders have survived. Previously, only the enumerated schedules from censuses were kept. So these household schedules from 1911 provide a unique view on individual acts of protest. The records are particularly rich as they often have layers of fascinating information on the forms, written by people inside the house themselves. Some suffrage supporters refused to give information, while others made protest statements on the census forms, thereby risking a £5 penalty for a no return or a defective return. Suffrage protesters often articulated their own arguments in their own words on the forms. So in this example, Constance Long turns the government's language back on themselves, circulating the word person and writing, "No other person, for women are not legally persons." So it's these kind of insights that are particularly amazing from the 1911 census and give it such a richness. Sometimes the additional comments by enumerators are also recorded, giving an extra layer of information about the protests and the individuals. In an article in the Daily Mail, the prominent suffragette Annie Kenney noted that if the suffrage bill was passed, passive resistors would send in their full details to rectify the missing census information. The 1911 census can show us a range of powerful things about suffrage supporters. So the census captures famous suffragettes alongside little-known individuals. It represents suffrage supporters from many different societies. It shows the suffrage movement was one that spread far and wide across the country, not just affecting metropolitan areas. And it shows at times a microcosm of family politics on a single census sheet. So there's a huge amount that can be gained from these kinds of records. So I'm going to explore some of the examples that we have in our records at the National Archives, particularly focusing on some of the innovative protests and some of the handwritten phrases in suffragettes and suffragists' own words. So first to the case of Sofia Dilip Singh. She was a Maharaja's daughter, now well known for her involvement with the suffragettes. She protested in really interesting and innovative ways. Sofia's godmother was Queen Victoria, and she lived in Hampton Court in an apartment in Faraday House that had been gifted to her by the Queen as a grace and favour property. Indeed, the image on screen was printed in the Suffragette newspaper, and it shows Sofia selling copies of the Suffragette outside her home in Hampton Court Palace. Her campaigning included being present at the front of the infamous Black Friday protests and supporting the Tax Resistance League, who claimed taxation without representation is tyranny. In 1911, she evaded the census from Hampton Court, which was a really bold move. And on her census form she scrawled, "No vote, no census. As women do not count, they refuse to be counted." Across London, another police observation was underway, much like the one outside Onslow Studios. This time it was in the depths of Putney Heath. The small gathering consisted of Mrs. Marshall and 9 other females, who each refused to give their details. In typical suffragette style, they had a newspaper photographer with them, ready to capture and publicise the moment. Mrs. Marshall actually referred to Kitty Marshall, who was one of Emmeline Pankhurst's bodyguards. In an attempt to physically evade the census enumerators, these women had camped out in the heath in 3 caravans. Despite the police observations, nothing more than the number of women and Mrs. Marshall's name was recorded. So there's very sparse information on the eventual census sheet. 2 days later, on the 4th of April, the front page of the Daily Sketch showed a motley group of women outside their caravans, all holding up "No vote, no census" banners. So they'd managed to court the publicity that they were hoping to attract. The census was nationwide. While some of our suffrage records at the National Archives are very concerned with events in London, such as the militant activities, the census shows individuals taking action in their own ways all across the country, in an attempt to win the vote. Ethel Schaider, a widow of private means living in Lambethurst in Kent, wrote on her census form, "Being a woman householder but having no vote, I declined to fill up this paper." She was one of the individuals we know very little about. The census protest, however, gave her a voice. We now have her argument for boycotting preserved in her own words. So this is really the power of the census in relation to the suffrage movement. But not everyone boycotted. Emily Wilding Davidson was an innovative campaigner and activist. But rather than following the conventional form of protest, she chose to make a different type of statement. Emily had joined the Women's Social and Political Union in 1906. She was believed to have been the instigator to setting fire to post boxes as a method of protesting. So she was constantly innovative and creative in her campaigns. On census night 1911, Emily snuck into the House of Commons in an act of defiance, and she was ultimately recorded as hiding in the crypt of Westminster Hall. We can see that noted on the census forms. In an era where women could not vote or be members of parliament, she was making a powerful statement, choosing to be actively recorded in an exclusively male political domain. So rather than invading, she was actively presenting herself and making herself noted. Emily is largely now remembered for running out in front of the King's horse at the Epsom Derby, and this was just 2 years after her census protest, so this is 1913. She died a few days later from a fracture at the base of her skull. Her death was arguably a turning point in the movement and gained a lot of public sympathy. As well as these dramatic protests, the census can show us the human side of being involved with the Votes for Women campaigns. And it's one of my favourite things that we can draw on from the census records. At times we can see family dynamics and tensions in the home on census night. So this is shown in particular in the case of husband and wife Edward Arthur Maund and Eleonora Moore in Hammersmith. On census night in 1911, Eleonora tried to evade the census. As the head of the household, her husband had included her details anyway, against her will. Defiantly, she crossed out her name. If she wasn't to be treated as a citizen with a vote, why should she be counted? However, the form has additional comments from her husband, Edward. We can see this in the red ink at the bottom of the screen. He re-added Eleonora's census details and the following comments. My wife, unfortunately being a suffragette, put her pen through her name, but it must stand as correct, it being an equivocation to say that she is away, she being always resident here, and has only attempted by a silly subterfuge to defeat the object of the census, to which, as head of the family, I object. And then he signed his name. These comments display the complexity for many of involvement in the movement for women's suffrage. To her husband, Eleonora's passionate belief in votes for women was unfortunate. Overall, we know very little about Eleonora's life and political affiliations. She's a classic example of someone that the census can shed some light on for us. She married her husband Edward in 1892 in St Pancras, when she was just 19 years of age and he was 42. By 1911, they'd been together for almost 20 years, and their marriage actually spanned many of the key moments in the development of the women's suffrage protests. For example, from the founding of the militant WSPU to the Black Friday protests in 1910. Despite the fraught tensions at home, Eleonora appears to have been committed to her local suffrage society, the Hammersmith branch of the WSPU. Now, this was a particularly active branch of the union. She's listed as supporting the raising of funds for Self-Denial Week, where suffrage supporters would deprive themselves of luxuries and fundraise for the union. And there's an image on screen from the Suffragette newspaper of general preparations for Self-Denial Week in the WSPU headquarters. Eleonora also helped out with their jumble sales as well. While these might seem mundane or maybe trivial activities, in many ways they underpinned the work of the whole organisation. The WSPU could not instigate its mass militant actions without sufficient funds and support. For many local branches, this would have been their core activities. In addition, the suffrage press indicates that on occasion, Eleonora used her home to store items for WSPU exhibitions, took in WSPU postal communications, and even held some meetings there. What would her husband have made of this? Surely there would have been a lot of tension around these issues if the census form is anything to go by. Without the census form capturing Eleonora's protest, we would know so much less about her. The wonderful thing about the census boycott is that they capture many suffrage supporters we would otherwise know very little about, the kind of foot soldiers behind the movement. The case of Eleonora and her census protest shows the potential complexities of engaging in protests around the issue of votes for women. Resisting the census wasn't an easy choice for many. I think it's now very easy for us to believe we would have boycotted the census or engaged in campaigns for the vote. But ultimately, this was often a very tough decision for people to make. They were standing so far outside of the kind of traditional expected role of women at the time, just by being disruptive. In getting involved in census boycotts, they risk fines, but also potentially a safe home or a happy marriage. So finally, I just want to reflect on some tips for searching for suffrage supporters on the census. And these can be applied to both evaders and non-evaders. They're just some very general pointers. So you can try searching the census using some of the following phrases. The names and addresses of known suffrage supporters, that's probably the best place to start, particularly if you're looking for a specific individual. But do bear in mind that people, as we've seen, weren't necessarily at home on census night. They might have gone to other gatherings or to a friend's house. You can also try and search anonymous in the name field, where there's an absence of information. It can be tricky to find people or to prove that they boycotted if it's just not possible to find someone. But that's a good starting point. It's also possible to use phrases in the keyword field, such as some of the key slogans like "No vote, no census." And finally, you can also use the occupational keyword field to search for suffrage-related professions. So I was quite pleasantly surprised to see that even where people didn't boycott the census, they would sometimes put their political roles, such as suffrage organiser, or their position within a particular society. So it can be worth trying that as well. Even if you don't have an individual you want to find, I would really recommend just searching some of these records and seeing what comes up. There's some amazing stories that you can follow and find through the census. There are some incredible secondary sources, such as the talk No Vote, No Census by Elizabeth Crawford, which is on the National Archives website, and Jill Liddington's talk Vanishing for the Vote, as well as Elizabeth and Jill's published works, which are incredibly helpful resources to tracing suffrage campaigners. And finally, one of the best resources is the Mapping Women's Suffrage project. So this website illustrates much of what I'm trying to convey in this talk, that the women's suffrage movement was a vast national movement made up by so many different types of supporters from so many different types of societies. And for each person who was involved, they had their own level or comfort zone of what they were able to do and contribute. And so we can see people all over the country that were involved in suffrage protests to the extent that worked for them and their lives. And the census is clearly a brilliant resource for that. The Mapping Women's Suffrage project is a work in progress, but it aims to identify and map the locations of as many Votes for Women campaigners as possible across cities, towns and villages, using 1911 as a kind of snapshot or a flashpoint. And the work so far has shown wonderfully rich examples of some of the, in particular, local women's suffrage campaigns. So really, the Mapping Women's Suffrage resource is a brilliant resource, and I can't wait to see it develop more to kind of explore some of these amazing lives and stories. In conclusion, the true scale of the protest will never really be known, but they certainly put another layer of pressure on the government in demanding votes for women. And this was just one of the campaigning methods that was being used in 1911. They were resourceful and had multiple ways of campaigning. Despite the threat, none of the women were fined for their involvement in the census boycotts, but they weren't to know this at the point that they got involved. Once again, suffrage supporters had disrupted the normal running of government. Households across the country reminded the government of their belief in votes for women and the lengths they were willing to go to. Thank you very much for listening.